Perfect. Okay, go ahead.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Kambat, and I represent Almaty American Space. And I'm pleased to welcome you guys to our weekly philosophical talk with the great philosopher Stephen Friedman. And today we're going to have a special guest, CG Consul General Eric Meyer. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Kambat, and greetings to everyone. Just wanted to wish everyone an early happy Independence Day to Kazakhstan. We're celebrating that next week. I wanted to come and introduce Stephen today because this is the last talk of the year. Stephen will join us again after the New Year's holidays. But I wanted to express my appreciation to Stephen for the talks that he's given over the last several weeks. Stephen would probably agree that we should be talking about philosophy all the time. But, you know, certainly this year, which has been a very challenging year, philosophy has become even more important for us as we address many, challenging issues. And Stephen, over the last few weeks, has taken us on a journey to talk about a wide range of topics with a philosophical perspective in science, literature, talked about gender-based violence last week. Each talk has been unique, and you're not going to hear this perspective anywhere else. And Stephen, I just want to express my deep appreciation to you. You're volunteering your time doing this. It's late in the evening. I just want to thank you very much for doing these talks and for your time. We greatly appreciate it, and I know our viewers and listeners have learned a lot from you. So on behalf of the U.S. Consulate, thank you very much for your time, and we're very much looking forward to today's talk. So with no further ado, I give you the New York Times proclaimed genius philosopher, Stephen Friedman. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eric. I first want to express my appreciation for the opportunity. I want to express my gratitude to the American Consulate in Almaty and the staff that's made these weekly talks possible. That includes Tracy, Kimbut, Elmira, our previous moderator for most of the talks, Shirin. I want to welcome our new moderator, Ignaz, and especially Eric Meyer, Consul General, for facilitating a philosophical perspective, on fundamental issues of our time and of all times. So I look forward to continuing the talks again in the next year, beginning in January. I think we're scheduled to start again January 15th. In the interim, I suggest people take advantage of the opportunity to go back and look at previous talks. These are not always easy subjects to address. My talks in particular tend to be sometimes dense. They're not intentionally so, but the nature of philosophy, the nature of the subject matter makes it sometimes unavoidable. And even though I'm aiming, and philosophy is aiming for a deep simplicity, achieving that simplicity can take considerable effort. It's taken considerable effort on my part, over the course of my lifetime. And so when you're encountering material that's new, or perspectives that are unfamiliar, and I'm sure that from many of you, a lot of these perspectives may be unfamiliar, then a second visit or a third visit, is likely to be illuminating. You'll discover that things that seemed obscure or not to make sense or not to have a real point actually all kind of converge upon meanings and understandings that help us come to terms with virtually every aspect of our lives, every aspect of contemporary experience. So again, I'm thankful that you're joining us tonight. I welcome you to revisit talks that I've given, and I hope to see you again after the new year, beginning January 15th. Okay.
We all look forward to that, Stephen, and thank you for coming back to resume the talks in January. And I'll just emphasize what Stephen said. Please do go to our social media, and the talks are recorded. You can go back and view them again, or catch subjects that Stephen covered that you missed. So the floor is yours, Stephen. Thank you so much again. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. Okay, everyone. Tonight's talk is actually on two basic subject matters that I've decided to combine, for the last talk of the year. One is computer science, and the other is the year-end holidays, including Independence Day in Kazakhstan, including religious holidays like Christmas that are celebrated at the end of the year, including New Year's, to welcome in the new year. Now, from the title of tonight's talk, Einstein, computers are useless, or maybe not, and Van Gogh's shoes, something of the eternal, you probably get the sense that I'll be taking a somewhat different perspective on these issues than you might ordinarily encounter. And again, that's the point. But the perspective that I'm taking is not willfully odd or different. It's different because of the nature of philosophy itself, and how philosophy sees the world and sees the issues in the world that are of fundamental concern to human beings. Okay, so I begin with that quotation from Einstein. The complete quotation is actually, computers are useless. They only give answers. And it turns out that Einstein isn't the only person who said that. It was also said in virtually the same words by Picasso. It's an interesting convergence. And again, I stress the notion of convergence, that philosophy deals with divergent circumstances. The fact that we are all fundamentally, rigorously different from each other, from everything else. That's how we exist at all. Everything else operates according to various types of convergences. Meanings and significance is in the nature of various things that we either bring together or see coming together. We can say that the world we see around us, the world we normally experience, the world of language, of concepts, of familiar objects, of social structures, of our normal and enduring institutions, is a world of convergent structures, things coming together from a lot of different directions and from a historical lineage as well. Philosophical truth is in a different direction. It deals with the limit of rigor. And rigor is interested in distinctions, because wherever any distinction exists, whatever applies to one element, one object, need not rigorously apply to the other. And it turns out that philosophy is really the elaboration, the development, the exposition of the implications of that degree of rigor, the limit of rigor. Everything else is less than that level of rigor. And that includes science. That includes computer science. That includes, again, everything in our normal experience. Well, one thing to note about that statement by Picasso and Einstein is something that we've actually referred to in the past, that when you hear such a comment that maybe disagrees with your sense of the subject, that, computers in some obvious sense are not useless. But when you hear, such a proclamation, one instinct is to just dismiss it. Well, they were joking, or they were wrong, okay? One thing I've stressed, and I stress this as a heuristic. Now, the logic of philosophy is rigor, and it delineates, it elaborates, it describes what I call an epistemic space, a space in which everything is rigorously so, incontrovertible, incontestable, is known without any shadow of a doubt. Okay? It operates at that high level of intellectual standard. Everything else is heuristic. It's not rigorous, so we can't know it to be incontestably true. But it, as a heuristic, it helps us in some way. It helps us create objects, products. It helps us make discoveries. It provides a path to things that are of interest and of value in helping us survive in this world. It creates tools, as computers are tools. The one thing it doesn't do, the fundamental thing that anything within a heuristic space, a convergent space, a non-philosophical space, a non-rigorous space, does not do, cannot ultimately do, is save us in the religious sense of a complete solution here and now, and independent of all possible future experience. That's what the limit of rigor, when it's properly developed, achieves. It achieves the logic of what religions aspire to. That's been one of the major themes, of these talks, and it's a theme that I'll continue to develop because it's so fundamental, to the nature of philosophy and the implications of philosophy that it takes time to appreciate what it really means. But everything that is not philosophical is heuristic, helps us in some way. Our beliefs, our opinions, our theories help us in some way. Well, one of the ways that philosophy is distinguished from the heuristic realm is in the questions that it asks. And this gets to the point of what Einstein and Picasso were saying. Philosophy, again, as a rigorous undertaking that, when done well, can address all human concerns here and now, has enormous power, is responding to one fundamental question. And it's a question that begins with Socrates, the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition, and it was embraced probably most fully by a 16th century French philosopher, Montaigne. Montaigne was profoundly influenced by Socrates and wore a medallion on his chest that in French said, "Que sais-je?" which means, what do I know? Socrates begins what we call today the epistemological tradition, the investigation into the nature of knowledge, and in particular, whether what we think we know, we genuinely know. And if we do genuinely know it, how exactly do we have that knowledge? The way that philosophy addresses many human concerns is that much human suffering, anxieties, fears, concerns, much of much, or actually all of the tragedy, what we see as the tragedy of the human condition when we experience it in that way, is because of imagining knowing what we genuinely do not. There's an aphorism, a kind of a concentrated statement of philosophical thought and result. I write in aphorisms that I've given before that's worth saying again. We suffer not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. So philosophy begins, again, at least from Socrates, with an investigation into what we genuinely know. What do I know for sure, as I stand right here, right now? It was the major theme of the work of Descartes, René Descartes, another French philosopher who's considered to be the starting figure of modern philosophy. And it continues through the work of philosophers like Wittgenstein, the great 20th century philosopher, who was the most important influence upon my work. So that question, that type of question, is at the core of philosophical investigation. It's not the type of question that computers generate, certainly not on their own. Other types of questions have been decisive in the development of culture, in the development of science, in the development of all aspects of civilization, in the progression of understanding. Questions like, well, the question that Darwin asked himself, that basically was the starting point for the theory of evolution. Why are there no rabbits in South America? A question that you would not think has any deep significance or connection to anything that would follow, but what followed was the theory of evolution. I mean, that wasn't the only ingredient, but that was the spark. The theory of evolution, as I talked about before, is as powerful a theory as the human mind has engineered. If you have any doubt about the theory of evolution as a powerful and active contributor to our understanding of the world and the advance of the biological sciences, well, just read Charles Darwin's original work on the origin of species. I read it when I was in middle school. I was young. I read it actually as part of an English class. We were doing book reports on literature of the 19th century. And people were reading books like novels by Thomas Hardy, an English novelist, who was influenced by the work of Darwin that had just appeared, like in 1859. Well, I wasn't that interested in literature yet. I was much more interested in science and math. Not yet, or that was actually the beginning of my interest in philosophy. But I took advantage of the opportunity to read, and do a book report on something relating to late 19th century thought. And so I read On the Origin of Species. And after 100 pages of about a 500-page book, depending upon the edition, the amount of evidence that Darwin provides in favor of that theory is overwhelming. The only reason you would have to doubt the theory is if you haven't read that book, because Darwin knew what he was confronting. Now, when it comes to a matter of evidence, we're talking about convergence, things coming together from a lot of different directions. When we're talking about science, when we're talking about decision-making, we're talking about going in the direction of the greater convergence, turns out. The question, for example, we now have vaccines emerging for COVID-19, right? Vaccines against the coronavirus. If you're asking yourself, should I take a vaccine? Well, you evaluate the nature of the evidence for and against, the convergence going into taking, the convergence to not taking. The convergence going into the decision to take is all of the studies, all of the people that have been given the vaccine that avoided the illness, all of the people that were given the vaccine that avoided negative side effects. So you're adding up basically all the factors, all the convergences, all the things coming together, and where those are adding to something stronger than the alternative, the evidence against the vaccine, you choose it. That's why the vaccine today was approved. For example, the Pfizer vaccine was approved for use in the United States on an emergency basis because the evidence led convergently to embrace that choice. Other questions that have been decisive in motivating thought, that make the question more important than the answer that the computer can help us achieve. Not that the answers are not going to be important, but the questions over and over again turn out to be the most decisive element, and especially the questions that no one had ever asked before, for whatever reason. That question that Darwin raised was first raised by Darwin. Similarly, with the falling apple and Newton. Paul Valéry, a French 19th century poet, once said, "Everyone could see that the moon does not fall. Everyone except Newton. It was obvious to everybody the moon is not falling, it's going around the earth endlessly. To Newton, the question was, why is it not falling? Because with the work of Galileo and Copernicus, where suddenly the sun was theorized to be at the center of the solar system and the earth to be moving around the sun, the earth was no longer seen as special as it had been seen as special by Aristotle and the scientists and thinkers that followed for 2,000 years. Special, or 1,500, yeah, about 2,000 years. Special in the sense that it was believed that the nature of the earth was change. The nature of the heavens was changelessness. That's why the heavens have been seen as the site of God or deity, changeless. Well, if you place the earth out into space going around the sun, then suddenly the earth is fundamentally the same as other objects that are moving around the sun, like the moon or other planets. Well, if things in the vicinity of the earth are experiencing gravitational attraction, then the kind of gravitational attraction that produces the fall of an apple to the ground, then maybe that gravity, why shouldn't that gravity extend to the moon and pull on the moon and draw that into the earth? Well, that was the question, one of the fundamental questions that Newton asked himself. And in dealing with the answer to that question, basically modern physics was born, Newtonian physics, that led to the Industrial Revolution, led to, and ultimately would lead to the refinement of Newton's work by Einstein, and with even deeper insights. But it's a matter of the questions that are being asked. And those questions change everything and lead us in directions that we never would have imagined. So we can see why creative geniuses, and Picasso and Einstein rank as two of the greatest creative geniuses, the greatest creative intelligences that humanity has produced. If you have any question about Picasso's intelligence, I recommend going online and reading looking up and reading some quotations by Picasso. He didn't write lengthy works, but a lot of his comments and, again, concentrated statements, aphoristic statements, just like computers are useless, they only give answers, were preserved, and they're striking. They're striking to such a degree that when I began writing philosophy seriously, again, many years ago now, after about 5 years of writing philosophy, it was hard for me to read the work of, it was hard for me to read, just other people's work, because the opening sentence or two would reveal certain limitations. And again, especially limitations from the perspective of the standards of rigor that I was elaborating and that interested me. As an example of that, just a few weeks ago, I was helping somebody, a student, with an undergraduate undergraduate philosophy course at a local college. The course was based on the professor's notes about each topic that the class was discussing. And each topic might have had several pages of notes prepared by the professor. Well, there wasn't I'm not going to mention the college and I'm not going to mention the professor, but there wasn't a single sentence in those notes that were supposed to be philosophical remarks and philosophical assessments that rose to the level of rigor that philosophy demands. In other words, whatever we might call the notes that were being prepared by this professor, they did not rise to the level of philosophy. They were not philosophy. So that's been an experience that I've had, where the opening sentence, the opening paragraph of a book can reveal the limitations of the perspective of the author if you're coming to it from a philosophical perspective where the standards of rigor are as high as the human mind can imagine or entertain. Okay? Well, so for a number of years, I might read for some entertainment, some diversion, but not so much for illumination. Okay? Certainly not philosophical illumination. The one person during this long period of time that I found myself able to read with excitement and to derive illumination from was Picasso. Picasso, in fact, would often describe himself as not having been a painter, but a poet. And again, you might think that that was just kind of a perverse way for him to describe himself, like he's playing with his audience. But when you read his comments about art, about life, one is more willing than not to embrace that perspective that he elaborated. So I've mentioned in the past that Wittgenstein liked to begin his writings with quotations. I, in my early works, did the same. And one of my early aphoristic books, which ran to a substantial number of aphorisms, maybe 700, 600 aphorisms. It's a book called Disquisitional Simulacra. It is the most obscure top title I've ever given to a book. One day, if it comes up, I'll go into the details of that title. But most of the titles of my books are not obscure in that way, but that was a kind of a technical work and it seemed like an appropriate title. But I wanted to begin with a quotation, and I chose for the opening quotation, initially, a quotation from Einstein, the actually best philosophical remark that Einstein ever made. Comment was, "It is the theory that decides what we can observe." Okay, that was an Einstein philosophical remark. Einstein saw himself as a physicist and philosopher. His philosophical writing in general was not at a level that commands really our contemporary interest, but it infused his work in physics. It was what made all the difference in his contributions to physics. I've often characterized, and I think I've done it in these lectures, characterized his relationship to physics as elaborating the physics of existentialism, of the view that we cannot leave the world to describe the world from the outside. We have to describe it from where we are. And when one makes that attempt, one gets relativity theory from Einstein, one gets quantum mechanics through the work of Heisenberg. That's, again, the physics of existentialism. But as compelling as that comment was by Einstein, I felt drawn to answer it with something that was even more compelling philosophically. And it was a quotation by Picasso. So on the opening page of my book, I had, as it were, dueling quotations. A quotation from Einstein that I just told you. It is the theory that decides what we can observe. And I answered that with the following quotation from Picasso. Mathematics, trigonometry, chemistry, psychoanalysis, music, and whatnot have been related to Cubism to give it an easier interpretation. This has been pure literature, not to say nonsense, which brought bad results, blinding people with theories. So we have an affirmation of the importance of theory by Einstein. He was a scientist. He elaborated theories. He was a theoretical physicist. Picasso, on the other hand, was an artist, and he was creating objects. Objects are not theoretical. Objects have an insistent reality. How we want to see the object, discuss the object, view the object can be variable, depending upon whoever is viewing and discussing. Art has that sort of malleability, that variability inherent in it. But the importance there was the rejection of theory as the most important aspect or element of what we're striving for. The same thing is true of philosophy. I've written in that play that was made available a few weeks ago for viewing, Valeris's Bowl, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World. I talk about how philosophy is not interested in opinion, belief, faith, assumption, theory. It's interested in the incontrovertible. So whatever is theoretical does not rise to the level of rigor that philosophy demands. Now, in general, science does not rise to that level, including computer science. There's a lot of, and I know I'm going to talk more specifically about computer science in just a second. I'm building up to this. I told you we're going to take a slightly unusual sort of point of view. The core of science, and I've talked about this previously too, but again, it merits discussing again, is the controlled experiment, right? I mean, that's been the essence of what's been done to validate the effectiveness and the safety of the vaccines that are now being released. The controlled experiment, where you take two objects, two individuals, whatever you're doing the experiment on. If it's two individuals, you give, the example I sometimes use is one, a potential, you have two individuals that have the same type of cancer. You give one a potential drug, that might be effective against that cancer. You give the other patient a sugar pill, and you see who lives longer, who does better, whose body is able to subdue the cancer. Okay? And you draw conclusions. The problem is that controlled experiments are always based on comparisons. And for the comparison to yield a rigorous result, something capable of only one clear interpretation, the two objects or individuals that you're comparing have to be perfectly identical. Any difference between the two means that whatever difference there was in the outcome of drug versus placebo doesn't necessarily relate to the drug versus the placebo, but any other factor that might be different between those two individuals. Well, among the factors that can be different between those two individuals or two objects that you're doing an experiment on is where they're positioned. That's enough of a difference that rigorously one can't draw a rigorous conclusion or result. Now, it turns out that one simple way to see how controlled experiments are theoretically impossible is that the world is different in different directions. And so something over here, something over there are in different environments. That difference in environment is enough to invalidate the rigor of a conclusion that you're going to draw. Now, this doesn't matter when you're doing science in the sense that scientists aren't thinking in those terms, but it ultimately matters because it matters in terms of the absolute rigor of our circumstance. It matters that we cannot make any two things perfectly identical. Whatever allows us to say that we're dealing with two things and not one is what invalidates the rigor of any conclusion that we draw. It is theoretically impossible to draw a rigorous conclusion from a controlled experiment. Another way to say it is there's no such thing as a rigorously controlled experiment. The even deeper aspect that undercuts the possibility of a controlled experiment that lies at the basis of scientific conclusions is even if the world were identical in every direction, just the notion of difference in direction is enough to invalidate the rigor of a conclusion. Okay? So, turns out philosophy is at the highest level of rigor, everything else, including science, a level below. That's and the fact that that's so is a more important aspect or circumstance of our world, of our reality, of the nature of reality than the denial of that or the overlooking of that. Well, if that being the case, you will often see books. If you go to a bookstore, go online, there are lots of books written about the implications of scientific results for philosophy, the implications of the philosophical implications of relativity theory, the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics, the philosophical implications of computer science, the philosophical implications of virtual reality, the philosophical implications of artificial intelligence, the philosophical implications of neuroscience, and what we understand increasingly about the brain and its functioning and its logic and its physiology. There are whole libraries of books devoted to each one of those topics. If you go to journals, like in philosophy, you'll also see endless articles written about just what I've laid out, the philosophical implications of all of these different branches of science. Well, it turns out that all of those books and all of those articles betray a fundamental misunderstanding, both of science, the nature of science, and of philosophy, the nature of philosophy. Turns out that because philosophy is at the highest possible level of rigor, a level of rigor, incontrovertibility, that exceeds that of science, no scientific result has any bearing whatsoever on philosophy. No scientific result has any impact upon our philosophical understanding, on the nature of those incontrovertible philosophical propositions that form the body of philosophy itself. And we can take it even a step further. Scientific results are able to help us survive. They're able to develop vaccines. They're able to develop increasingly treatments for diseases. They're able to develop computers. They're able to develop all manner of technology. Right? That's in fact the test of science, ultimately. That if a scientific result, if our physics did not allow us to build bridges that could support us, we'd throw out that physics and develop a new physics that could create the technologies that served our interests and our needs. We say that technology is a criterion of the power of science and the power and effectiveness of a scientific theory. Philosophy does not require anything outside itself for validation. Philosophy doesn't need to make us happy. It doesn't need to design better rockets. It doesn't need to cure diseases. It just needs to be absolutely rigorous. But it turns out that in developing that rigor, philosophy is able to both achieve, again, what religions aspire to in terms of Buddhist enlightenment or Christian salvation, those types of complete solutions here and now, and also by clarifying the difference between the epistemic, the incontrovertible, the absolutely rigorous, and everything else, where everything else is heuristic and everything else operates according to the logic of convergence. Philosophy is able to give guidance to every other field, every other technological enterprise. It's something that I actually demonstrated some years ago after I wrote my first philosophical work in terms of making an application of this type of reasoning to the requirements for an effective chemotherapeutic agent that could work against cancers. And that led to the development of mutated viruses that are actually one aspect of the development of current vaccines, not the mRNA vaccine, not the Pfizer vaccine, but like the AstraZeneca vaccine is based upon some of the theoretical work that I had done many years ago when I was actively involved in molecular biology. But I was involved in molecular biology partly as a graduate student in molecular biology, but also I was interested in using some of my philosophical results to demonstrate the power of philosophy to drive molecular biology in the way that physicists like Einstein and Heisenberg recognized the power of philosophy to drive physics at the highest and deepest levels. So, science is a tool, an instrument that helps us. And when I say a heuristic is anything that helps us. Anything that helps us solve a problem, develop a tool, develop a better rocket, whatever it is, make discoveries, but that is not based upon an absolute rigor. So we can't know in advance if it's going to work. We have to build it, we have to test it, we have to see, okay? Philosophy, because it's dealing with an absolute rigor, does not need to test. Everything else does. The vaccines, no matter what the theory behind them, needed to be tested. So this notion of heuristics, of being useful, of being helpful, of being a tool is central to computers as one of maybe, if not maybe the single most powerful tool that our science has engineered. And to show you the connection between what I've been saying about heuristics and achieving solutions to problems, right, that we otherwise have to raise, right? We raise the questions and then we can go to the computer and help find answers, right? Well, one of the most famous of all computers is the computer in Stanley Kubrick, the great American director's 2001: A Space Odyssey, a film that came out in the late 1960s and was considered the most revolutionary film of science fiction that had ever been created. And still, all of the science fiction films that we see, especially films like the whole Star Wars enterprise, ultimately take their genesis from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's often ranked as the greatest of all films. And when it's not ranked as the greatest, it's ranked somewhere, among maybe the top 10. Well, one of the main characters in that film, arguably the main character, was a sentient computer, an artificial intelligence computer called HAL, H-A-L. HAL was an acronym. It stands for Heuristically Programmed Algorithmic Computer. Heuristically programmed. Now, I did not get the word heuristic from that use, but I might have. It turns out I first encountered heuristic from a work by Einstein. It's a work that I recommend. I haven't read it in many years, but it had a profound effect upon me. Maybe it's dated now, it's hard to imagine, but the work was The Evolution of Physics that Einstein co-wrote with Leopold Infield. And Einstein uses that word heuristic. It was an important word for Einstein. And that's how I learned it. The idea of a device that helps us solve a problem without rigorously doing so. Okay? Well, so computers are heuristic devices. They are problem-solving devices. We have to give them the questions, give them the problems, and because they're not operating at the highest level of rigor, because they are tools that science has engineered, they're not going to save us, okay, in the way that religions imagine our need to be saved, and that the limit of rigor can and does when it's fully understood and embraced. But they are powerful, powerful tools. And a couple of things about that. The vaccine has, been one vaccine. Actually, a number of vaccines are already in release around the world. There's a vaccine from China that's been released, a vaccine from Russia that's been released, the Pfizer vaccine. There are other vaccines in line. So we're going to have a lot of vaccines. That's a characteristic of technological results, of heuristic results. In general, there's more than one solution to any given problem. That is something illustrated by the great mathematician Gauss, considered one of the three greatest mathematicians, along with Archimedes and Newton. Gauss was a 19th century mathematician. He solved what's called the fundamental theorem of algebra. I won't go into the details of that, but the point is he solved it in four fundamentally different ways, okay? That's typical of heuristic results. It's possible to approach a given solution from a variety of different directions. Vaccines illustrate that. But while the vaccine has been in the headlines, another result that is likely to have far more profound implications for the future of humanity as we know it, and the understanding of and conquest of disease happened just a few weeks ago. The fundamental problem in biology really is the design of proteins. Proteins are molecules, they're called macromolecules, they're large molecules. You hear about protein as being an important component of a diet. Well, proteins are basically the molecules, the elements of life that are in charge of what a cell, a body is doing moment to moment. They control cell chemistry. Proteins are coded for by DNA, ultimately. You've all heard of DNA, the genetic code, the blueprint for each individual, the blueprint for life. Well, what that blueprint is encoding for, the building that's being made from that blueprint, is a protein, or many proteins. In the human being, there are about 30,000 different proteins. Each protein is made up of a sequence what are called amino acids. You might have heard of amino acids. You can buy them as supplements. There are 20 different amino acids in nature. They occur in a given protein in a certain sequence. A given protein might be anywhere from about 50 amino acids. Think of them as like beads, in a chain. 50 amino acids to 500 amino acids. And there are 20 basic different naturally occurring amino acids that make up those chains that make up proteins. Okay, you change one of the amino acids, you get a slightly different protein. You change one amino acid, you can go from a protein that is properly functioning to one, that causes severe disease. Okay, so it's the sequence of amino acids that ultimately is folding three-dimensionally to make the protein that then is controlling what our cells are doing, what we are capable of. Okay, they're central to life as we understand it. Well, one of the fundamental, if not the fundamental problem in biology is how a sequence of amino acids can be how we can predict from a given sequence of amino acids what the final protein will look like. Because it's the final form of the protein that's active, that is functional, that's able to carry out the tasks that the cell requires. It's the final shape of the protein that determines whether that protein is functioning well or functioning badly, whether it's promoting our health or whether it's contributing to a disease process. If we can understand how a sequence of amino acids exactly folds and predict how a given sequence will fold, then we can increasingly design and redesign and be in control of the whole logic of protein function. That is central to biology, central to the cure of disease. Well, it turns out that a company in England, DeepThink, has artificial intelligence systems, computing systems that they've been developing that recently has come close effectively to solving that problem. They've been able to predict, there are annual competitions to see if researchers are able to predict the actual shape of a protein from its sequence of amino acids. And this program was able to do so with an accuracy, I think, in the 90% range, extraordinarily effectively. So this was a major breakthrough in terms of the future of biology, of biotechnology, of the conquest of disease. That is a result more significant than the development of vaccines, which basically elaborate a process that we've been exploring for many decades. This is new. This is the new frontier, and it was achievable through artificial intelligence. And what artificial intelligence is doing, by the way, is seeking patterns. Seeking patterns, achieving convergences of an enormous amount of data. It's a heuristic process. In philosophic space, any two things are rigorously different. But when we're looking for solutions to the things that can help us survive, we're looking for similarities. Any two things, as I've said before, are approximately the same, rigorously different. How they are approximately the same facilitates our science and technology, facilitates the work of artificial intelligence. It's looking for certain similarities that we can exploit, that we seek. How things are rigorously different is what philosophy is exploring. That's the basis of salvation, ultimately. But survival depends upon seeing and exploring and gleaning, discerning these patterns, these similarities. And that's the kind of thing that computers can do. That's the kind of thing that artificial intelligence can do. That is the essence of a heuristic process that is in the nature of a convergent process, bringing many things together and assessing it for certain deep similarities, okay? Now, one thing I wanted to point out, computers have a language. They have machine language, it's called. That machine language takes the form of just two symbols, 1 and 0. If you went online and looked up, the machine language, of a computer just to get a sense of what it looked like, you would see an endless string of 1s and 0s in different orders. Okay, that's how we give instructions ultimately to computers. That's what computers understand. The languages that the programming languages that we use are ways of communicating with machine language effectively. But it's the machine language, 1s and 0s, that relate to the fundamental logic of the computer, of its circuitry, of the hardware of the computer. A 1 represents something being on. You think of like the 1 and the 0 as like a switch. 1 means the switch is on, 0 means the switch is off. Anything that has those two different states, a state of being on, a state of being off, or at least anything that is capable of a binary sort of configuration can be the basis of a logical system, the logical hardware that can be built into a computer. Transistors have done that. Silicon diodes, do that. But there are varieties of ways that you can achieve that encoding in the hardware of a computer of an on and an off. Well, and that is fundamental to how computers function, how they think. Well, it turns out that that's also fundamental to how we think. Our neurons basically work with an on-off logic. A given neuron, a given brain cell, which we have billions to a trillion, can either be actively firing, it's called an action potential. It can be on or it can be off. And it's digital in the sense that there are lots of stimuli that a given nerve cell can receive that will not trigger the switch turning on. It will not trigger that cell being turned on. Once the cell is turned on, it's a 1, like in the computer language 1. When it's off, it's a 0. So our brains actually display the same fundamental logic that a computer does. That's not an accident, okay? It's ultimately why computers are capable of doing the degree of intelligent functions that we see. It's why it's possible to think in terms of computers as being intelligent. It's ultimately why we can imagine computers as being capable of thought and consciousness. Now, the best insight into that circumstance was probably given by Wittgenstein, the philosopher, again, who was a major influence upon my work. Wittgenstein once wrote, "Is it possible to create a machine that thinks? A human being is just such a machine." Now, we're not made up of the same kind of hardware. We're made up of proteins and nerve cells and biological, what are called macromolecules, like complex biological molecules. And because of the complexity of those molecules, it may not be possible to create, using current computer hardware, something that quite approximates us. But in principle, it's possible for a machine to think because we think. And we represent the machinery of cells and proteins and biological molecules and biological systems operating according to the laws of physics and chemistry. So there is a strong convergence there, and that convergence is an inspiration for people designing computers. It's also an inspiration for people like in neuroscience, studying the nature of our thought processes, how we think. Those kinds of convergences, again, lead to discoveries. They don't serve philosophical ends, they serve scientific ends. They can help us create better computers, better artificial intelligence systems. Another thing comes up when we're talking about advanced computer sciences is virtual reality. One of the most important things about virtual reality is that we call it virtual, right? That we can distinguish in some way between the virtual reality that we're achieving through a computer and the reality that we otherwise recognize. So sometimes people say, well, we're effectively in a virtual reality. That's actually suggested. That's an example of how science can heuristically advance our thinking, infuse our thinking, inform our thinking, that can make for new discoveries, new ways of looking at the world, of manipulating the world. In a sense, we can think of our brain as a virtual reality device. We're taking in information and where our brain is processing it to create the sense of the world that we have, that we experience, what we see, the forms in which we see it. But it's a metaphor. It's a heuristic. It's something that we can play with. It's something that we can write books about, science fiction about. It can guide us in the development of science and technology. But the important thing to keep in mind is that we can't remove our brain. We can't see the world from the outside of our mind to fully evaluate the nature of what we're saying is an artificial, a virtual reality sort of device or helmet that our brain represents. So it's a heuristic claim that doesn't rise to the level of the rigor of our circumstance. It doesn't rise to the level of the kind of perspective that's the basis, again, of relativity and quantum mechanics. A description of the world from where we are, not in terms of some imagined ability to project ourselves outside of it. An imagined ability to project ourselves outside of it can lead to different results, but it doesn't lead to philosophical results. It doesn't lead to rigorous results. It might, again, change our thinking about something that can lead to a new set of tools or a new set of theories. But again, these theories are not rigorous, right? These theories are less than the philosophical, which ultimately means that these theories can't serve our deepest needs, our most definitive interests. Okay, let's see. Now, in relation to what I just said about virtual reality devices, there's a film I just saw that I recommend. It's a short documentary, What Animals See. The platform I saw it on is an American television platform, HBO, but it's on platform Curiosity Stream. You would have to search for it, What Animals See. And the professor that narrates the documentary is a professor at the University of Maryland, a biologist. So if you're looking for it, make sure that the narrator is a professor from the University of Maryland. Then it's that same documentary that I'm talking about. And it's a documentary in which biologists, neuroscience, is trying to understand how animals see the world. Now, there's a lot that we can study about animal visual systems. We can study their eyes. We can get a sense of the kind of wavelengths of light, kind of colors that their eyes are sensitive to. Dogs, for example, we have 3 different types of receptors in our eyes for 3 different colors: red, green, blue. Dogs lack red, so their world is greenish blue. Okay, so we can have a sense. We can, by the density of receptors in the eye, we can get a sense of how sharp the vision is. We can kind of imagine how a hawk is seeing the world, or an animal of prey like a squirrel or a rabbit, where instead of having a central area of very clear vision surrounded by a periphery that's much kind of more blurry, as the case of our eyes, they have a strip along their eye that has enough density of visual receptors that basically they're seeing the entire horizon, 180 degrees on one side with one eye, 180 degrees on the other with the other eye, in clear and sharp focus. They need to be able to detect predators that might be on the horizon, where predators typically come from. So we can get a sense of what the animal might be experiencing. There are some fish, sea creatures, who have 12 different color receptors. They're basically seeing not the 3 colors that we're seeing in different combinations, but 12. So they're seeing a very enriched visual and colorized image of the world. Other like bees see in ultraviolet. So we can get a sense of the differences, and we can get a sense of what colors these animals. We can't obviously get the sense of how an animal that's seeing in ultraviolet is seeing the world, because we don't respond. Our eyes don't respond to ultraviolet. But for situations where there is an overlap, we can get some sense, but the scientist narrating this made some very astute philosophical remarks about the topic. He was saying that no matter how we're able to understand the structure of the eye and the composition of the eye in a given organism, we are never going to be able to experience the world, see the world as that animal does. And he made the point that even if we had highly developed virtual reality systems, we would not be seeing ever the world, experiencing that world ever the way that animal fully does. It's a point that we need to be much more aware of, in the sense that the same thing is true for our relationship with other human beings. We can never experience another person's reality without living it. And living it doesn't mean just walking in their shoes. It means being born into their world from the moment of their birth. And that means not being ourselves at all, never having been ourselves. It's because of this distinction between our circumstance and that of another human being or another animal that we're not in a position rigorously to judge. I've made that point as well. So even artificial intelligence capabilities, even virtual reality devices cannot bring us rigorously to that point of experience of something else. That we're always going to be, if we don some virtual reality device, seeing it through our eyes, our consciousness. And that makes all the difference when it comes to an ultimate claim, a philosophical claim. And those are the only claims, again, that rise to the level of rigor, that are incontestable. It can't be explained away in some other form. Religiously, and I've made this comment before too, religiously we're told, not to judge. Well, philosophically, we can't judge because we don't have access to the vision, the perspective, the genuine full experience of another living thing, no matter what. And interestingly, the same argument applies to God, if you believe in a deity, like a God, and his or her or its ability to evaluate and judge our circumstance. Rigorously, not even a God can judge, because not even a God is capable of entering our circumstances as if he or she or it were only and always in our circumstances. And again, that distinction between being fully and completely us versus something else for some period of time is enough to invalidate the rigor of a claim of one thing to the other. Okay? Well, computers, artificial intelligence, are dealing in a heuristic space, and not a rigorous space, a convergent space. They're seeking convergences. They're seeking patterns. They're seeking repetitions. Repetitions, patterns, are in the nature of our annual celebrations, right? When we are celebrating a new year or an Independence Day, when we're celebrating Christmas or some other occasion, on an annual basis, right? And that's what these year-end celebrations involve. We're celebrating what? A circumstance that relates our Earth to the sun and the relative position of the two against the background of the stars. That at December 25th of every year, or January 1st of every year, whatever the occasion might be that we're celebrating, the Earth is in the same relative position to the sun as it was the previous year, and the year before, and the year before that, and 2,000 years ago. But not precisely, approximately. These repetitions are never exact, not to the standard of precision, again, that rigor demands. And so the simple fact is that the fact that things are approximately the same, as I've said before, allows us to celebrate these repeated events. But the fact that they're not exactly the same makes all the difference. And that relates more to the fundamental nature of our experience, of what it means to exist at all. It's what makes it possible for us always to have hope that the future can be different from the past. Aside from the fact that the future hasn't happened yet, the fact is that every year at this time, things are not exactly the same. No two things, no two circumstances, no matter what the time interval between them, will ever be an exact mirror of the other. And that makes all the difference. That's what frees us from despair, ultimately. That's what makes it possible for us always to have hope, that no matter how many times we've failed, or no matter how many times we've been frustrated, or no matter how many times our dreams haven't been realized, the next time, the next effort, the next year could make all the difference, because 1 year is not exactly the same, no matter what. Another thing about these holidays, these occasions, these events, is they're in heuristic space. They represent convergences. In the case of a religious holiday, they represent convergences from the entire history of that religious tradition. They represent convergences of all the major events that are being celebrated. They represent convergences of all the previous times that we celebrated. Each year that goes by that we celebrate a given event is enriched by the previous year's experience of that event. That adds to the convergence that enriches the experience, right? That's the nature of the celebration. We add elements each year. The previous year's experience is added as an additional element, and the event can grow in significance and continues to grow and continues, and then we add more elements, we add more fireworks, or we add more presents, or whatever it is that we're doing to enrich, embellish the event. We're achieving a higher order of convergence. So just as convergence explains the operations of artificial intelligence, it explains our inclination and our embrace of a holiday, like a New Year's. But Van Gogh never painted Christmas trees, right? When you look at the work of some of the greatest artists, especially since in more recent centuries, they're not so much celebrating these festive occasions, these extraordinary occasions. They're more celebrating the commonplace, the ordinary, the daily. Van Gogh would paint an old pair of shoes because he wanted to show the divine in those shoes. He wanted to elevate the ordinary to the extraordinary. That's the artistic vision. Van Gogh famously remarked, "I want to paint men and women with that something of the eternal that the halo used to symbolize, and which we seek to give through the actual vibration and intensity of our coloring." The most important thing about Van Gogh is not the art that he achieved, but the vision of the world that he had, his seeing his neighbors with that sense of the eternal. He was seeing them as noble. He was seeing them as transcendent. Even if they were a postman, he was seeing them as divine. So he wasn't looking to, in general, Van Gogh did not paint portraits of Christ, not very often. He was much more devoted to painting neighbors, ordinary people, we would say, and finding in them that sense of divinity, that sense of transcendence. Picasso put it well. Some painters transform the sun into a yellow spot. Others transform a spot, a yellow spot, into the sun. That's the impulse of art, or much art at the highest level. That is the impulse of philosophy, right? That it's not a matter of what might come tomorrow or the day after tomorrow as a sense of fulfillment. It's a matter of finding right here, right now, in the circumstances of our existence, the broad, general, but specific circumstances, of our life that elevates it to the level of what? The transcendent. That allows us to see in the here and now the full solution, the full power and majesty, the extraordinary nature of existence itself, right here, right now, in the ordinary objects around us. Not to require a special occasion, a special event, but to see in daily life the fulfillment that we don't need to expect, we don't need to seek in the day after. We need to find it right here, right now. And what allows that is that exploration of the limit of rigor. The world not seen in terms of what we imagine the past to have been, and not seen in terms of what we imagine the future to offer, but in terms of the full force and reality of the present, what's around us. What was most magical in the paintings of Vermeer, the 17th century Dutch painter, who's seen as one of the greatest of all painters, who Picasso once commented he would trade all of Italian art for a single Vermeer. Well, the most magical element in the paintings of Vermeer, which were in interiors, Dutch interiors, were their walls. The walls were objects of mystery that seemed to contain and illuminate the full mystery and power of existence itself, of being itself. That's what philosophy is seeking. That's what philosophy is achieving at the limit of rigor. And that's something that's present here and now, and independent of all future experience, and does not demand a special occasion, special holiday, a special celebration. It's seeking to elevate, to ennoble just the ordinary, so that it rises to the level of the extraordinary, of the special, of what we can celebrate on a daily basis, no matter what. So I think that is basically what I wanted to say. Let me just say a few things about what's to come. I've been developing certain basic ideas, right? Fundamental philosophical ideas on rigor, truth, beauty. It's sometimes I talk about the distinction between the heuristic, as I did today, in terms of what we use to help us survive, versus the epistemic, what's certain, what's incontrovertible, what can save us. These are things that I'll be developing further. Each week, starting again in mid-January, we'll have specific topics that I'll be approaching from the philosophical angle, and seeing these topics that are otherwise discussed, maybe in a scientific context or in a psychological context or a political from a political viewpoint, seen from a philosophical, will not only help illuminate the nature of the political and the psychological, the sociological, the aesthetic, but will also help us better understand the nature of philosophy itself, that's trying to come to terms with every aspect of human experience. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Friedman. We have one question left from previous talk about gender inequality. Mr. Friedman, what does philosophy think about solving the problem of gender inequality, and can this problem be solved?
Yes, well, okay, so two aspects to the problem. Anytime we're dealing with achieving a certain goal, and gender equality represents a goal. Goals are achievable by some degree of convergence, some number of elements that have to be brought together. The more elements one brings together, the stronger the goal is that eventually is achieved, is accomplished. Well, one of the fundamental mistakes that people make in their thinking about the world and about problems is that there's a specific key that we need to find in order to solve a particular problem. Like the vaccine, is seen as like the key to solving a pandemic, but it's not the single element. All of those public health measures that people have been encouraged to adopt, like mask wearing and social distancing, that's part of a solution too. A vaccine is potentially a strong element. That means a strong convergence. One of many elements, but the more elements we bring together to gain a specific goal, the more likely we are to achieve that goal. The same thing for gender inequality. It's a matter of approaching it from many different directions, not just one, and it's likely to have a solution that evolves over time and is gained only through a persistent effort. Even persistent effort represents additional convergences. So one of the things I was talking about last week when I was talking about gender violence was just the problem of our language. When we talk about putting a man on the moon, well, we're putting a human being on the moon. When we talk about it being a man, when we emphasize man, we're kind of giving sort of weight to what critics call the patriarchy, that bias towards the male over the female that helps support that gender inequality. When we talk about putting a plaque on the moon, we came in peace for all mankind. No, we have to go beyond that language. So language itself is an element, but it's just one element. We have to be aware of the problem. That awareness matters. We have to have children in schools reading about the problem. Those represent convergent elements towards a solution. We have to, I think I mentioned last time that there was a film I saw recently where the main character, the son of the main character said to this other character, a woman, that he he couldn't talk to girls. Well, we need to, boys need to be talking to girls. It's like, even at that level, it's like when we go to war with people, it's often people that speak a different language. If we're not speaking the same language, if we're not communicating, we're not going to be achieving a level of equality. So the point is, it's many factors. And it's a matter of being aware of the problem. It's a matter of attending to the problem in our language, in our actions, but it is something that is capable of evolving over time. And it's something that needs to be enforced by the laws of society, by the not just things that are voluntary, but by things that are required of us. So it has many elements of a solution, just as any object or goal that we're trying to achieve does. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Gable. I'm a regional public engagement specialist in Central Asia. And I am closing Stephen's talk today so that we can say thank you to him. During the last 3 months, he has taken us on an amazing journey from a philosophical perspective on the many difficult things that are facing the world today. And some of those are good, some of those are bad, but maybe actually they're all a little bit of both. Maybe that's what we've learned through these talks. Stephen donates his time for these talks. He's very enthusiastic, and he values very much being able to share thoughts and ideas and hear your questions and your ideas as well. So thank you, Stephen, so much for doing this for these 3 months. We're just taking a short break during the holidays, and we look forward to welcoming Stephen back in the new year, a fresh start. And although I know we don't need a holiday to understand the importance of life and of contemplation and of all of these things that Stephen has talked to us about. I do wish everyone watching happy holidays, and I hope you end 2020 well and begin 2021 even better. And again, thank you, Stephen, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Tracy, as I appreciate all the efforts of the American Consulate and Almaty, everybody involved. And I appreciate our audience, being involved in these talks. And yes, I want to wish everyone happy holidays, a happy new year, and I look forward to continuing next year, with this journey that is, as in the nature of philosophy itself, boundless. So yes, I appreciate your participation, and I look forward to your continued involvement. Thank you so much.
All right, so it's time to end our philosophical talk for this year. Thanks to everyone who joined and who participated in this interactive discussions throughout these 3 months. And we wish you happy holidays and happy